Welcome to Sherlock Tales, where every mystery comes alive. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, give this video a like, and share it with your fellow mystery lovers. Tell us in the comments, which part of the world are you watching from? Let's solve mysteries together.
It was on a wet October morning that the affair first came to our attention, though at the time neither Holmes nor I could have guessed the labyrinthine depth of the puzzle soon to unfold. The fire crackled in our Baker Street sitting room, casting errant flickers of gold across Holmes's angular profile as he reclined with eyes closed, his long fingers steepled under his chin. Outside, the fog rolled in thick waves across the cobbled street, muffling the city to a dull hum broken only by the clatter of carriage wheels and the call of a newspaper boy announcing some scandal in Parliament. I had just set aside the Times, having skimmed yet another dreary political column, when a sharp rap came at the door. Before Mrs. Hudson could even stir, Holmes's voice called lazily, "Come in, Inspector. You're 23 minutes earlier than I estimated." Lestrade entered with his usual air of doggedness, doffing his bowler and stamping the wet from his boots. "You're not wrong about the time, Holmes. Train was quick this morning, but I've come on business. Nasty one." Holmes opened one eye, waved him toward the hearth, and motioned for me to take notes. Lestrade drew a folded envelope from his coat pocket. But it was not the letter that first caught my eye. It was the photograph clipped inside it. "I've seen murders," Lestrade began grimly, "but this one's different. Man named Percival Sutcliffe, retired banker, lived alone in a townhouse in Marylebone. Found dead in his study yesterday morning. Single bullet through the chest, door locked from the inside. No signs of a struggle." Holmes remained silent, but his gaze sharpened. "Now, ordinarily, I'd think suicide," Lestrade went on. "But the angle of the wound's wrong. Ballistics say it came from the front, low and to the left. And here's the strange bit. A photographer, freelance name of Arnold Bellamy, says he was hired to take Sutcliffe's portrait for a vanity commission. Claims he arrived at 10:30, knocked and got no answer. He waited, then heard a sound, like a shot. Police were called. They broke in through the French doors from the garden." Holmes finally reached for the envelope. "And this photograph?" Lestrade nodded. "Bellamy swears he took it yesterday. Says Sutcliffe insisted on a dry-run test shot just before the real sitting. But here's the catch. Look closely at Sutcliffe's waistcoat." I leaned in with Holmes as he studied the print. It showed a distinguished gentleman seated in a leather-backed chair, one hand on a walking stick, the other resting on the arm. At first glance, nothing appeared amiss. Then Holmes frowned, tilted his head, and tapped the image with a long forefinger. "Oh," he murmured, "so that's your trouble." "What is it?" I asked. Holmes handed me the photograph. "Dr. Watson, you have an eye for detail, though not always the most observant one. Do you see the watch chain?" I looked again. Indeed, a gold chain crossed the man's chest, tucked into his waistcoat pocket, but it was unfastened at one end, dangling rather awkwardly, as if broken or never clipped properly. "Exactly," Holmes said. "A man of Sutcliffe's generation and profession would never have tolerated such disorder in a formal portrait. The chain is not simply dislodged, it is cut, and yet Bellamy insists this was taken before Sutcliffe was found dead." Lestrade nodded grimly. "That's not the only issue. The sitting room was immaculate, except for one thing. A cracked photograph frame on the fireplace mantel. Broken glass and the photo inside missing. And what did it contain?" Holmes asked. Bellamy couldn't say. "But the housekeeper, an old woman named Mrs. Rance, says it was of Sutcliffe and a young woman, his niece, I believe, recently engaged to a man Sutcliffe disapproved of." Holmes stood then, moving to the window with a sudden energy. "Tell me, Lestrade, has the camera been examined?" "Bellamy still has it. It's a bulky German make, takes plates rather than film. No other exposures on it except this one." Holmes turned back with that peculiar gleam I had learned to dread and admire in equal measure. "You will, of course, allow me to speak with Mr. Bellamy, but first we must visit Marylebone. There's something wrong with that room, something missing. The photograph, the chain, the position of the body. No, Lestrade, this is not a simple case. Someone has killed a man and tried to make truth lie within an image." His eyes glittered. "And that, gentlemen, is where they made their mistake." The fog had thickened by the time our hansom cab clattered its way through Marylebone, curling in ghostly ribbons between the gas lamps and clinging to the eaves of townhouses, like some silent witness. Holmes sat forward, fingers laced beneath his chin, his gaze fixed on a point only he could see. I recognized the expression well. He was not idle. He was arranging, turning over the evidence in that cavernous mind of his and placing it into a logic no one else could yet see. The Sutcliffe residence stood on a modest crescent of brick facades and wrought iron gates, flanked on either side by quiet, respectable neighbours. The curtains on most houses were drawn against the drear, but the one belonging to the late Mr. Sutcliffe bore a faint light in the drawing-room window, and a police constable stationed firmly at the door. Lestrade was already ahead of us, flashing his credentials and exchanging a few brisk words with the constable. Holmes barely paused to acknowledge either man as we entered the house, his boots silent on the thick carpeting. The air inside smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and floor polish, undercut with something colder, an emptiness that clung to the walls like dust. The housekeeper, Mrs. Rance, a pinched woman of advanced years and suspicious eyes, hovered in the hallway wringing her hands. "If you'll kindly take us to the study," Holmes said, barely glancing at her, "and see that we are not disturbed." The study was a gentleman's sanctuary, dark oak panels, a well-stocked bookcase, a heavy mahogany desk, and a worn leather chair angled just slightly toward the fireplace. Nothing was overturned or ransacked. The room bore no signs of panic or violence, beyond the conspicuously bare space on the mantel, where the missing photograph had once stood. Holmes moved through the room like a man deciphering a private code, his fingertips grazing the air itself as he observed. He paused before the fireplace, kneeling slightly to study the marble surround. I noticed him lift a small shard of glass from the floor with a pair of tweezers, hold it to the light, then slip it into his coat. "Watson," he said, motioning for me to join him, "you recall Lestrade's mention of the French doors?" "Yes, the police entered through them after the photographer reported hearing the shot." "Indeed. Note the carpet here." He gestured to a thick Aubusson rug that stretched nearly to the door. "It has been straightened. See here, the indentations do not align. Something heavy was moved, perhaps after the photograph was taken." He stood, brushing the dust from his knees, and turned his attention to the large armchair. "This is where Sutcliffe was sitting when the photograph was taken," he said quietly. "But the photograph was not captured at the moment Bellamy claims." "How can you be certain?" "Because Sutcliffe is dead in it." I blinked at him. "Holmes, you can't mean—" "I do." The slackness of the left hand, the pallor beneath the eyes, and, most telling of all, the unnatural rigidity of his pose. A living man does not sit so stiffly, unless he is consciously performing. And a vain man, as Lestrade tells us Sutcliffe was, would not tolerate such an unflattering likeness. That photograph was staged, not to capture life, but to present it. Before I could respond, a knock at the door signaled Lestrade's return. "I've sent for Bellamy," the inspector announced. "Should be here shortly." "But I thought you'd want this." He handed Holmes a folded sheet of paper, found it in the desk drawer under a false bottom. "Written in Sutcliffe's hand, I believe." Holmes scanned it quickly, his expression darkening. It was a letter, brief but emphatic, addressed to one Edwin Hartridge, and dated 2 days prior. It warned Hartridge to stay away from her, to abandon the fantasy of an elopement, and closed with the words, "This ends now, or I will end it for you." "Who is Hartridge?" I asked. "Sutcliffe's niece's fiancé," Lestrade said grimly. Evidently not well favoured by the old man. Holmes was silent for a moment. "Tell me, Lestrade, did the coroner note time of death?" "Around 10:30, give or take 15 minutes. And Bellamy claims to have arrived at exactly that time." "Yes." Curious, Holmes murmured, more to himself than us. "Then either Bellamy was the last to see him alive, or the first to see him dead." We did not wait long before the photographer himself was shown in. Arnold Bellamy was a lean man in his early 40s, with a neatly trimmed beard, and the slightly disheveled look of an artist who'd attempted respectability for the sake of appearance. His camera case, a large leather-bound satchel, hung from one shoulder. "I trust this won't take long," he said, eyes darting between us. "I've told the police everything I know." "I believe you've told them something, Mr. Bellamy," Holmes said coolly. "Whether it was the truth remains to be seen. Please describe exactly what occurred yesterday." Bellamy exhaled and glanced around the room. "I was hired through an intermediary. Never met Mr. Sutcliffe until yesterday. He contacted me by letter to arrange a portrait, said it was to commemorate his retirement. I arrived at 10:30 sharp, knocked, no reply. I waited 5 minutes, then heard what sounded like a pop or muffled bang from inside. Thought it might be a gun. So I went to the back and found the garden gate open. Called the police and they forced entry. Holmes studied him. And the photograph? Bellamy hesitated. That was taken earlier. A test shot. Sutcliffe insisted. And yet that same man now lies dead in the photograph you provided. I beg your pardon. Bellamy blinked, startled. Holmes walked slowly to him, holding out the print. The man in this photograph is deceased. You can either admit that the photograph was taken post-mortem, or I can demonstrate it to the magistrate with evidence. Your choice, Mr. Bellamy. Bellamy paled visibly. I didn't kill him. I never said you did, Holmes replied sharply. But you were used. The camera, the timing, all were part of a performance. The question is, who directed it? Bellamy swallowed. I was paid double my usual rate. The note said not to ask questions. I thought it strange, but you complied, Holmes finished for him. Did you take any other photographs? Bellamy shook his head. Just that one. Holmes turned to Lestrade. Have his plates seized and developed, all of them. And bring in the niece. We must speak with Miss Evelyn Sutcliffe. He paused as he reached the doorway, glancing back toward the empty mantel. The photograph that was stolen holds the emotional key to this case. The image Bellamy captured was the physical lie. But it is the missing image, the one removed, that tells us who feared the truth. And with that, Holmes swept from the study into the fog once more, leaving only the faint scent of tobacco and suspicion in his wake. We found Miss Evelyn Sutcliffe at the home of a family friend in Chelsea, a modest brick town house shaded by elms and ivy. It was Lestrade who made the official request for her presence, though Holmes insisted we accompany her return journey in the same cab to Baker Street. She was a woman of perhaps 24, with a bearing at once refined and quietly anxious. Her morning dress was already in place, though the edges of the hem looked newly stitched, hastily prepared. Her gloved hands clutched a folded handkerchief, and though her eyes were not red from tears, they held a watchful wariness that Holmes did not overlook. You knew Mr. Bellamy, I presume? Holmes asked as the cab rattled over the cobbles. I met him once, she said. He came to take Uncle's photograph the morning he... She faltered, glanced away, then added, I wasn't present. Yet you were living in the same house. No, Uncle Percival sent me to stay with Mrs. Littleton 3 days ago. She met Holmes's eyes. It was not my idea. Was this related to your engagement? Yes, she said, her voice tightening. He didn't approve. Edwin and I had plans to marry quietly in the spring. Uncle said he would cut me off entirely if I did. Holmes folded his hands. Why did he disapprove? She hesitated, then said, He believed Edwin wanted me for my inheritance. He'd taken it upon himself to manage my affairs since my parents died. I never asked him to, Lestrade interjected. What do you know of this letter we found in your uncle's desk, threatening Mr. Hartridge to break off the engagement or face consequences? Evelyn's eyes narrowed. I hadn't seen it, but it sounds like him. Uncle thought control was a form of love. Did you love Mr. Hartridge? Holmes asked. There was a pause, barely perceptible, but it was there. I did, she said, almost too quickly. I do. Holmes said nothing more for the remainder of the journey, but I could see his mind working behind the silence, like a windmill spinning through a gale. Back at Baker Street, Holmes seated Evelyn in the armchair opposite the hearth, while Mrs. Hudson brought in tea. Lestrade, for his part, remained by the window, arms crossed, eyeing Evelyn with the look of a man who saw a possible suspect in every gentle reply. I sat at my usual place near Holmes, my pen idle on the edge of the notebook. Miss Sutcliffe, Holmes began gently, you understand, of course, that we are not seeking to distress you, but certain inconsistencies have surfaced in the narrative surrounding your uncle's death. Chief among them, the photograph taken by Mr. Bellamy. You've seen it? She nodded faintly. The inspector showed me. And yet the photograph on the mantel was missing, Holmes continued. Mrs. Rance, your housekeeper, said it was of you and your uncle. It was. Can you describe it for me? Her fingers tensed around her handkerchief. It was taken when I turned 21. Uncle insisted on marking it with a formal portrait. We were standing in the conservatory, he in his favorite blue waistcoat, me in a dress he had bought from Paris. Would you say the expression on his face was affectionate? She blinked, caught off guard. Yes, he smiled. I don't think he often smiled in photographs. And who removed it from the mantel? I don't know. Try to recall if anything had changed about the photograph recently. Was it always on display? Yes, until 2 days ago. I noticed the frame was crooked, and then it was gone entirely. Holmes stood and turned toward the fire. Then we are dealing with a lie that was not merely captured, but arranged. He turned back to her. Did your fiancé ever visit the house in your uncle's absence? Once or twice. To bring letters, flowers, but never stayed long? No, Uncle forbade it. Holmes paced toward the window. And if your uncle were to discover something incriminating in Mr. Hartridge's past, a motive for him to keep you apart, how would you have reacted? Her voice lowered. That would depend on what he discovered. Holmes smiled faintly, though it held no amusement. What if I told you that the real issue here may not have been your uncle's opposition, but something your uncle learned, something he may have seen just before he died? She looked up. What do you mean? But Holmes did not answer. Instead, he crossed to the mantel, where a sheaf of photographic negatives now lay in an envelope, brought in earlier that morning by a constable following our search of Bellamy's studio. He pulled one free and held it to the window light. What is it? I asked. He handed the negative to me. A second photograph, Watson. Taken with the same lens. But the subject is different. I studied the negative. The exposure showed Sutcliffe once more, seated in the same armchair, but not alone. A second figure stood behind him, partially obscured by shadow. I couldn't make out the face with certainty, but the height, the stance, and the outline of the lapel suggested a man. Young, upright. Hartridge? I asked. Holmes nodded. A fair assumption. This plate was not developed, and for good reason. It contradicts Bellamy's story. This photograph was taken before the fatal one, and therein lies our clue. Lestrade came forward. You think Hartridge was there? I do. And I think Sutcliffe found out something he was not meant to, something Hartridge wanted hidden. So the first photograph was never meant to be seen, and the second, the one of a dead man, was staged to imply the old banker died alone. Evelyn had gone pale. You're saying Edwin lied? I am saying, Holmes replied quietly, that someone went to great lengths to control what was seen, to curate the truth, as it were, through a lens. That is the peculiar power of photography. It captures not only what is, but what someone once remembered. He walked over to the desk and retrieved the cracked sliver of glass from his pocket. The broken frame confirms it. Someone destroyed the original image not out of grief, but to erase context. Just then a knock sounded at the door. Lestrade moved quickly to open it, revealing a tall, well-dressed man in a grey overcoat and gloves, Edwin Hartridge himself. He looked between the faces in the room, his own unreadable. I came as soon as I heard, he said softly. Evelyn, are you all right? She nodded, though her eyes had gone distant. Holmes said nothing at first. He crossed slowly to Hartridge and offered a hand. Mr. Hartridge, tell me, did you ever sit for a photograph with Mr. Sutcliffe? Hartridge frowned. No, why would I? Holmes turned to Lestrade. You'll find fingerprints on the undeveloped plate. I trust Scotland Yard still keeps the necessary powders and brushes? Lestrade nodded grimly. Then I suggest we take Mr. Hartridge in for a formal statement. Hartridge stiffened. On what grounds? Holmes gave him a smile as thin as wire. On the grounds, sir, that you forgot one crucial thing about a lie captured on film. It cannot change its mind. Edwin Hartridge did not resist arrest. That in itself was telling. He stood rigid and composed as Lestrade informed him of the need for a formal statement and the possibility of a charge pending further evidence. Evelyn rose as if to speak, but Holmes with a quiet glance urged her to remain seated. She obeyed, though her eyes followed. Hartridge to the door with a strange detachment, less the sorrow of a fiancé than the strained curiosity of a woman watching something unspoken unfold. Once the door closed behind Lestrade and Hartridge, Holmes resumed pacing, the fingers of his right hand rhythmically tapping his left wrist. I recognized the gesture. It meant the pieces were forming. But the outline of the puzzle had not yet declared itself. You see it, Watson, he said suddenly, turning to me. I see a photograph that was never meant to exist, I replied, and a second man trying too hard to pretend he was never in the frame. Holmes smiled faintly. Quite right. But the question, my dear fellow, is not merely what Hartridge was doing in the house, it is when. He crossed to the mantel once again and retrieved the two photographic prints, the staged portrait of the deceased Mr. Sutcliffe, and the undeveloped negative that featured Hartridge behind him. He laid both on the table side by side. In the photograph with Hartridge, Sutcliffe appears relaxed, at ease. Compare that to the corpse-like rigidity in the so-called test shot. There is no muscle tone in the limbs, no tension in the fingers. Dead men do not pose. But what if Hartridge did not come to kill? I stared at him. You believe Hartridge came for something else, an appeal perhaps? A final conversation? Perhaps, Holmes murmured. But I believe it is more complex than that. He turned suddenly. Evelyn, one more question if I may, she blinked. Yes? What would happen to your inheritance if your uncle died without altering his will? She hesitated but answered, It would revert to me. The last draft I saw left everything to me, even though he disapproved of my engagement. Ah, Holmes said quietly, but you assume that draft remained untouched. What if Sutcliffe intended to change it? What if that was the true reason Hartridge visited? Evelyn paled. You mean he went to stop the change? Holmes shook his head. That is one possibility. But I believe we are missing the true orchestrator of this performance. He turned to the photograph again. This image did not create itself. It was planned. And someone wanted the world to believe that Sutcliffe died alone, that it was suicide or at least a crime without witness. Bellamy claims he took only one photograph, yet the negative proves otherwise. He lied. You think Bellamy is more involved than we realized? I asked. I am now certain of it, Holmes said. We must pay him another visit at once. By the time we reached Bellamy's modest studio on Fleet Street, dusk was thickening and the gaslights were flickering to life. Bellamy's establishment occupied the second floor above a print shop, the windows shuttered and faint lamplight seeping through a crack beneath the door. Holmes knocked and we heard movement within, a chair scraping hastily, then a bolt being drawn back. Bellamy opened the door, eyes wide. I've already given my statement to the police, and now you shall give one to me, Holmes said firmly, stepping inside without waiting for invitation. I have no doubt Lestrade will find your photographic plates quite illuminating. But you have one final chance to be truthful, sir. I suggest you take it. Bellamy backed away as Holmes advanced, his presence at once calm and absolute. The studio was cramped and smelled of chemicals, sodium thiosulfate and old varnish. Shelves lined with glass plates and photographs framed in cheap brass filled the space, and on a side table sat the very camera we had seen described in Lestrade's notes. Holmes gestured to it. How many exposures did you take that morning? Bellamy opened his mouth to lie. Holmes raised a single finger. Think carefully. You are already complicit in the staging of a corpse. The question is whether you were a witness or an accomplice. Bellamy's shoulders sagged. 3. Go on. The first was of Sutcliffe and Hartridge. I was paid extra to take it, but told not to ask questions. Then Hartridge left the room. Mr. Sutcliffe remained behind. He seemed troubled, even agitated. He said something about destroying a document. I was packing up when I heard the shot. You did not run? I froze. It was only seconds. Then someone else, someone I'd never seen, came through the French doors from the garden. He was dressed in a long coat, gloves. I couldn't see his face clearly. He looked directly at me and said, We'll need one more photograph. And I just did as I was told. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Describe him. Tall, confident, young, maybe 30. He spoke like a gentleman, Eton or Oxford. And you told no one? I was paid, again, double again. I was told if I said anything, the police would think I staged it. And they would not be wrong. Holmes stepped back, hands behind his back. So there was a third man, someone with knowledge of Hartridge's visit, with access to the house and the boldness to manipulate the scene. He paused, then turned to me. Watson, what do we know about the housekeeper, Mrs. Rance? Only that she had worked for Sutcliffe for 20 years. She's the one who told us about the missing photograph. And conveniently absent at the time of death, Holmes said, eyes narrowing. She claimed to be at market, but I found no sign of a purchased parcel, no receipts and no vegetables in the larder that had not been there the night before. Bellamy looked stunned. You think she... I think, Holmes said darkly, that she may not be who she claims. I believe someone inserted themselves into that house, under the guise of loyal service, and someone with knowledge of the house's layout, the study's locks, and Mr. Sutcliffe's schedule orchestrated the entry. The shot and the cover-up, he straightened, then gave Bellamy one last look. You will go to Scotland Yard tonight and make a full confession to Inspector Lestrade. If you omit a single detail, I shall see to it that your career ends in disgrace. Bellamy nodded silently. Outside in the fog, Holmes walked briskly. It fits, Watson. The lie was not simply the photograph. It was the silence of a household too well arranged. Sutcliffe never expected betrayal to come from within. The man who entered after the shot, he was not an intruder. He was an insider, possibly a relative, possibly an heir. Then Mrs. Rance is our next visit. But I do not think she will greet us as herself. I believe we shall find an empty room and a trail already growing cold. He hailed a cab, and as it arrived with a clatter of hooves, he turned to me with a look of grim certainty. We chase not a murderer alone, Watson. We chase a playwright of death. A man who believes a lie, once captured by light, becomes truth. And with that we stepped into the cab, and the fog swallowed us once more. Mrs. Rance's lodgings above the kitchen were dark when we arrived at the Sutcliffe residence once more. The constable stationed outside gave a small start upon seeing Holmes descend swiftly from the cab, coat flaring like a raven's wing in the night air. She hasn't returned, the man reported, pulling his collar up against the rising mist. Went out just after noon, sir. Said she was visiting her sister in Kensington. Holmes said nothing as we passed inside. The house had an unnatural stillness to it now, as though some essential presence had quietly withdrawn. Without hesitation, he ascended the back staircase to the servants' quarters, and I followed, the narrow steps creaking beneath our feet. The door to Mrs. Rance's room was unlocked. A single lamp sat cold on the nightstand, and the bed was neatly made, too neatly. A quick inspection of the wardrobe revealed that her heavier coat and boots were missing, as were 2 travel trunks that had been present during our last visit. Holmes stood in the center of the room, surveying its barren cleanliness with narrowed eyes. She's gone, I said. Vanished. Holmes knelt beside the bed and ran his fingers lightly along the floorboards. At one edge of the room, he pried up a loose plank with a penknife from his coat pocket. Beneath it, wrapped in a linen cloth, was a small bundle of documents. He unwrapped it with the delicacy of a man handling a spider's web. Inside were several letters, a birth certificate and an old daguerreotype. I stepped closer as Holmes held the photograph toward the light. It showed a younger Sutcliffe, smiling awkwardly, arm around a woman with striking features, a strong jaw, sharp brow, and intense dark eyes. In her arms a boy no older than 10, not Mrs. Rance, I said. No, Holmes replied. Not in name. He thumbed through the letters quickly, scanning. Her real name is Lydia Bellam. The woman in the photograph was Sutcliffe's sister. Her name Isabel Bellam. This boy would be her son. Then Mrs. Rance is the boy's grandmother? More likely his mother, Holmes murmured, tapping the birth certificate. Lydia Bellam, mother to Charles Percival Bellam. Father unknown. He looked up at me. She inserted herself into the household under a false name to keep proximity to her half-brother. 20 years of silent service, Watson. Not for duty, but for observation. But why? Holmes wrapped the papers and rose, because the Sutcliffe fortune was meant to pass to Evelyn. But if Lydia's son was Percival Sutcliffe's legal nephew, then the will could be contested. Perhaps she hoped to find a document, a statement, some fragment of past recognition. And when Sutcliffe began writing a new will, perhaps removing Evelyn from the estate entirely, she had to act swiftly. But the killer was a man, I reminded him. Bellamy said so, Holmes nodded. Lydia Bellam was never working alone. She orchestrated the environment, Watson, the illusion of domestic constancy. But the hand that pulled the trigger was younger, faster. Her son, Charles, I frowned. Then where is he now? That, Holmes said grimly, is the next question. By dawn we had a name and a trail. Scotland Yard had begun assembling a dossier based on the identification Holmes provided. Charles Percival Bellam, age 27. Educated at a grammar school in Sussex before disappearing from public records a decade ago. According to Lestrade, a man by that same name had arrived in London 3 weeks earlier and taken up residence under the pseudonym Henry Malden, leasing a studio flat in Bloomsbury. He was described by the landlord as quiet, polite, but never in long. A man of little luggage but impeccable tailoring. We arrived just as the landlady was setting out to fetch milk, her basket swinging at her hip. She eyed us suspiciously until Lestrade produced his warrant. Holmes asked her to unlock the room while the constable kept watch by the alley. The flat was scarcely more than a sitting room and a cot, but what little it held spoke volumes. There was a heavy travelling coat folded over a chair, the same cut and shape Bellamy had described, and beneath it, a small black case that Holmes opened carefully with a penknife. Inside were letters, newspaper clippings, and a faded calling card bearing the name Arnold Bellamy, photographer of distinction. Beneath it, a note in an unfamiliar hand. He will be in the study at 10:30. Make it look like a disagreement. The photo must show calm. Lestrade cursed under his breath. They planned the entire scene. Bellamy lied about more than the photograph. He was hired for it. No, Holmes corrected him. He was recruited. Blackmailed, perhaps, but not the architect. I moved to the window and looked out over the rooftops of London, the city waking beneath a veil of rain. Holmes, I said, this entire scheme was founded not just on money or legacy, but on images. A photograph posed to lie, a memory erased. A servant who was not a servant. Holmes turned slowly from the case. Yes, and it was nearly perfect. But they underestimated one thing. What? The camera sees what the mind forgets. In the second photograph, the one with Hartridge, Sutcliffe is leaning slightly to his left. But in the final image, staged after death, his head is tilted the opposite way. Rigor mortis could not have shifted him so precisely. Someone moved the corpse. He stepped away from the case and faced Lestrade. We must locate Lydia Bellam. She may have fled, or she may be waiting to see how the play concludes. Either way, the curtain is rising on the final act. The break came sooner than expected. That evening, Lestrade returned to Baker Street with news. A woman matching Lydia's description had booked passage on a steamer bound for Antwerp, travelling under the name Margaret Croft. She'd paid in cash and boarded alone, but a telegram from Dover confirmed she never made it to the dock. Instead, a porter reported seeing a woman answering her description boarding a private carriage near Charing Cross an hour prior, accompanied by a tall man in a dark coat. "Charles," I said. "Indeed," Holmes murmured. "They're trying to vanish. But there's one place they cannot run from." "Where?" "The will," I stared. "You think there's a new will?" "I believe Sutcliffe wrote one and hid it. Perhaps in that very study, perhaps not. But he sensed betrayal coming. He may have tried to protect Evelyn in his final moments, not with a weapon, but with a pen. And if they knew. Then they staged the scene to destroy all trace of it." Lestrade stood. "We'll search the study again." Holmes raised a hand. "No need. There's only one place it could be." We returned to the Sutcliffe residence after midnight. The house was cold but undisturbed. Holmes went directly to the fireplace, knelt beside it, and began examining the grate. "Here," he said quietly. "Do you see, Watson?" I leaned in. Wedged just above the flue, folded and scorched but intact, was a packet of thick paper. Holmes retrieved it with a pair of iron tongs. It was a will dated 2 days before the murder. In it, Percival Sutcliffe revoked all prior drafts and named Evelyn his sole heir. Beneath his signature was a witness line, unsigned. "He never had time to complete it," I murmured. "No," Holmes said, "but he tried. And that, Watson, is what will haunt the true killers. They did not merely take a life. They tried to take its truth." And though the night was long from over, Holmes finally allowed himself a breath. Outside, the fog began to lift. The half-burnt will was placed in a sealed envelope and entrusted to Lestrade's custody by morning. The inspector, now thoroughly disabused of the case's simplicity, promised to have it examined by the Yard's legal counsel and forensically preserved. But even before official judgment could pass upon the document, Holmes was certain of its significance. He had held the scorched edges between his fingers, as though touching the very echo of the old man's dying resistance, a desperate final gesture against the slow encroach of betrayal. We returned to Baker Street that afternoon to gather our thoughts, and Holmes, ever restless when the core of a mystery remained unspoken, resumed his pacing. The fog had lifted somewhat, and outside, carriages rattled more freely over the cobblestones. Yet there was a heaviness in the air, as if London itself were waiting for one final curtain to fall. "The will changes everything," I said, as I prepared 2 cups of tea, "but it also suggests that Charles Bellam and his mother may not have known about it at all. If they had, they would have destroyed it more completely. Instead, they staged a photograph to suggest solitude. Why? Holmes paused mid-step. Because to them the crime was not only about inheritance. It was about narrative. A death without witnesses is an act of silence. A death in company, especially in conflict, opens questions. Questions invite investigation. But a man who dies alone in a locked room leaves nothing but conclusions. And Bellamy's photograph supplied the perfect illusion, I added. Holmes nodded. But illusion only works when no one notices the seams. And Bellamy, poor devil, was never trained to stitch corpses into stories. There was a knock at the door and Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram in hand. Holmes received it without comment, scanning the message rapidly. I saw his brow twitch, then still. It's from Dover, he said. A man matching Charles Bellamy's description has just purchased passage aboard a merchant vessel, the Adria. Departs tonight for Calais. No sign of the woman yet. They're separating, I said. Possibly, Holmes replied. Or staging one final deceit. We must go. If Charles is fleeing, he may yet believe the lie remains intact. But the moment the will surfaces publicly, he'll vanish beyond our reach. Within the hour, we were aboard a fast train bound for Dover. Holmes sat opposite me in the compartment, silent, but utterly alert. His eyes, half-lidded, flicked between the window and his own reflection, as if he were searching both for a truth still unstated. You've drawn a conclusion, I said at last. He didn't respond immediately. Then quietly, yes, but I've been resisting it. Why? Because it paints a portrait not of criminality alone, but of something deeper. A theater of grief, Watson. A tragedy, where even the villain believes himself the hero. Night had fallen by the time we reached Dover. Lestrade had arranged for 2 plainclothes officers to intercept the Adria before boarding. But Holmes insisted we approach discreetly, hoping to observe rather than alarm. The dock was slick with sea spray and lantern lit. Men hauled crates with rough curses and shouted in multiple tongues. Holmes scanned the crowd carefully, eyes narrowing. There, he murmured, touching my arm. A man stood near the edge of the queue, collar upturned, his figure unmistakable. It was Charles, tall, composed, watching the movement of the ship with a strange, calm detachment. Holmes moved swiftly, but without haste. We approached from the flank, and Charles didn't notice us until Holmes was beside him. I'd hoped you'd run farther, Holmes said lightly. Charles turned slowly. His eyes met Holmes without surprise. You found the will, he said. Of course, Holmes replied. And now you're preparing to vanish. France, perhaps, then onward to somewhere with no photographs. No names, Charles sighed. It wouldn't matter. The truth always finds its way back. You believe that? I didn't, he said with a faint smile. Until I met your kind. Holmes tilted his head. Then tell me why. Not the performance. The truth. Why did you come back? Charles turned his gaze to the water. The wind played gently at his hair. Because he remembered me. I said nothing, sensing the shift in tone. Percival Sutcliffe, Charles continued, was the man who abandoned my mother. He was the man who told her she had no family, no rights, no legacy. And then, years later, he summoned her, not to apologize, but to supervise. She became the silent maid in the house she should have inherited. I grew up watching her iron his shirts, prepare his meals, watch Evelyn ride to school in a carriage while my mother washed dishes. So you killed him, I said quietly. He looked at me. No, Doctor. I didn't come to kill him. I came to ask him to see me. Holmes remained perfectly still, and he did, Charles added. That morning in the study I told him who I was. I told him I wanted nothing. No money, no reparation, just acknowledgement. He stared at me for a long time. Then he said, You are not the first mistake I've tried to forget. The silence between us stretched. I left, Charles said, but I waited outside. And then I heard the shot. Holmes finally spoke. So it wasn't you? No, Charles replied. It was her, my mother. I think she was listening. I think she saw him reject me again. And in that moment she became someone else. He looked back toward the Adria. She wasn't meant to kill. She was meant to clean. But she cleaned everything, even the truth. Holmes stepped closer. Where is she now? Charles hesitated, then reached into his coat and handed Holmes a folded slip of paper. An address, a name. No words spoken. A moment later, Lestrade and the constables arrived. There was no struggle. Charles lifted his hands, quiet and calm, and allowed himself to be taken. As the lantern light faded behind us, and the ship's horn echoed across the harbor, Holmes and I stood watching the sea, our breath in clouds before us. "You knew it wasn't him," I said softly. Holmes shook his head. "I suspected, but I feared the alternative. What will happen to him?" "He'll be charged as an accomplice," Holmes replied. "But a clever barrister may argue diminished responsibility or ignorance. The true weight will fall on Lydia Bellamy and Evelyn." Holmes was quiet a moment. "Then she will inherit as her uncle intended, but she will carry questions now where certainty once stood." We turned from the water, the wind rising behind us, and as we walked back toward the waiting carriage, Holmes said, almost to himself, "It is a terrible thing, Watson, when men begin to rewrite their past in ink, and others finish the correction in blood. We did not wait for daylight." The address Charles had surrendered, reluctantly but without resistance, pointed to a modest boarding house in Lambeth, tucked along a narrow lane where the gas lamps flickered like nervous sentries. The street was quiet, too quiet, and the windows of number 17 were dark when Holmes and I arrived by hired cab. The housekeeper, roused from sleep and bribed with both charm and coin, confirmed that the woman calling herself Margaret Croft had paid for a week's lodging in advance but had returned only once briefly since. Renting the room, Holmes ascended the stairs like a man descending into an answer. He paused at the second floor, listening, his head cocked slightly to one side. No light spilled from beneath the door, no creak of floorboards. Still, he gestured for silence and withdrew his lockpick with ghost-like precision. The door opened on well-oiled hinges. The room was Spartan: single bed, writing desk, wash basin, and a small case by the window. The air inside was heavy with the scent of lavender and the faint tang of damp wool. Holmes stepped in first, his lantern cutting across the walls in wide arcs. I followed, eyes adjusting slowly. She was seated in the far chair, her posture impeccable. Her face, long unpainted and solemn, held no surprise when she saw Holmes. She had been waiting. "You came sooner than I thought," Lydia Bellamy said. Her voice was calm. Not defiant, but settled, as though she had made peace with the timing of things, if not their content. Holmes inclined his head. "Charles told us." "I expected he might," she replied. "He always needed closure." "I never did." He studied her a moment, then stepped fully inside. "You used Bellamy. You arranged the camera. You manipulated every detail of that morning, down to the cracked frame on the mantel. But you did not expect your son to give us your name." "No," she admitted. "I hoped he would vanish." "He deserves to. He was never meant to bear this." I approached slowly, heart pounding with the quiet awe of seeing a mystery embodied at last. "Why now? After 20 years, why strike then?" She turned her gaze toward me. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, did not flinch. "Because that house had become a mausoleum, Doctor. I lived every day with the knowledge that he, my half-brother, had erased me. Denied me after everything. I scrubbed his teacups, sewed his linens, raised my son while pretending not to. I thought perhaps in time he would soften. But the older he grew, the more he clung to his illusions. He called Charles the result of indiscretion, a shadow. And Evelyn? She had his blessing, his name. I couldn't bear to watch her inherit it all while my son vanished from every page." "You took the photograph of him and Charles," Holmes said. "And then the one after." She nodded. "I made Bellamy do it. I knew what kind of man he was, desperate, needing money. I told him it was for legal purposes, that my employer was ill and I needed proof for a trust. He believed me. Until the shot. After that, I let him believe whatever kept him compliant. But Sutcliffe's death, I pressed. "You shot him." "No," she said it evenly. "He shot himself." The silence in the room swelled. Holmes stepped closer, lantern trembling slightly in his hand. "Explain." "He did not take rejection well," she said. He had dismissed Charles again, coldly. I watched from the corridor as my son left, trembling with restrained fury. Percival closed the door behind him and stood staring at the fireplace for nearly a minute. Then he opened his desk drawer, took out the pistol I knew he kept, and sat down. Her voice lowered. He saw me as I stepped into the doorway. He raised the pistol anyway. Perhaps he thought to shame me. Perhaps it was one final act of dominance. I don't know. He said only, "You never knew your place." And then he pulled the trigger. Holmes said nothing. "Neither did I. I didn't scream," she continued. "I didn't cry. I closed the door, waited 10 minutes. then went to fetch Bellamy. I told him Mr. Sutcliffe wanted one last sitting, no speaking, no questions. He did as he was told. I guided the scene. I corrected the tilt of the head. I folded the hands. I brushed the hair. You dressed as suicide, Holmes said quietly, to look like a murder without witness. Because a suicide would have complicated everything, she replied. It would raise questions about the will, about the estate, about Evelyn, and Charles. But why not destroy the will entirely? She hesitated. I didn't find it, so you gambled, Holmes said. Yes, she admitted. I thought he may have left it unsigned, or that it had not been written at all. I'd watched him hesitate before, but I never saw him put it in the fireplace. Your son said he didn't know what you planned, she nodded, because I didn't want him to carry it. I wanted him to believe it had been justice, not despair. Holmes set down the lantern on the desk. And what do you believe it was? She met his gaze evenly. It was his final performance. I only chose the lighting. Lestrade arrived shortly after, and Holmes handed him a full account in writing signed by Lydia herself. She made no protest as she was taken into custody. Only once as she passed the threshold did she glance back at the room. Not regretfully, not mournfully, but like someone leaving behind the last act of a play. Outside, the fog had returned, blanketing the streets in familiar grey. We stood in the alley as the constables disappeared into the mist with their prisoner. Holmes lit a cigarette and exhaled slowly. A case built on images, Watson, not facts. Photographs posed to mislead, silence arranged as truth. But in the end, what truly gave her away? I thought, then said, the broken photograph. The one missing from the mantel. He nodded. Yes, because only someone who understood the power of memory would fear an image more than a witness. We returned to Baker Street before dawn, the lamps still glowing weakly through the heavy clouds. Holmes poured 2 glasses of brandy and settled into his chair with a sigh that did not quite conceal its weariness. I watched him for a moment before I asked, "Do you think Evelyn will ever learn the full truth?" Holmes turned toward the fire, eyes reflecting the flame. Only what she must. She need not carry the weight of every detail. Some truths, Watson, are not burdens, they are guardrails. She will learn to walk without falling into the shadows her family left behind. And Charles? Will stand trial, perhaps for conspiracy. But I suspect the court will find his guilt. Diluted. And Lydia. Holmes sipped once, then set the glass down. She chose clarity over chaos, a terrible kind of courage. He rose then, moved to the window, and stood there a long while. And in the flicker of lamplight and quiet rain, I saw what the photograph had never shown, the stillness behind the act, the sorrow behind the silence, the humanity behind the lie. The next morning broke with a sky the color of wet slate, and the streets of Baker Street glistened with the residue of overnight rain. The fog had thinned, but something heavier hung over us still. Not the mist of weather, but the weight of a case that, though concluded in form, had left a residue of unanswered questions in the mind. Holmes had slept little. I found him at his violin, drawing long uncertain notes in the air like a man tracing outlines he could no longer see. The music was aimless, not melancholy but unresolved. I watched in silence until he lowered the bow. "The final truth still eludes me," he said without turning. "It is not the mystery, Watson. That has been solved. It is the reason." I set down my newspaper. "You doubt Lydia's account?" He turned slowly, his gaze distant. "I believe she told the truth, her truth. But I also believe that truth was chosen with care, like the way one selects a photograph to display and hides the rest. You think there's more? I know there is." He crossed to the desk and pulled from the drawer the daguerreotype we'd recovered in her lodging. The image of young Charles standing with Isabel Belham, the woman presumed to be his grandmother, but more likely his mother. Holmes studied it again, as if the grainy smile of the boy might blink or speak. "I've been thinking about that moment, the one Charles described. When Sutcliffe said, 'You're not the first mistake I've tried to forget,' I nodded. It seemed like the wound that made everything bleed." Holmes tapped the edge of the photo with a fingernail. "What if it wasn't just cruelty? What if it was an admission that Charles had a predecessor, another child, another secret?" I leaned forward. "You think there was another heir, or an affair, or a betrayal long buried?" He rose abruptly. Come, we are not done with Sutcliffe's house. The Sutcliffe townhouse had returned to quiet. The front door was now kept locked under police seal, but Lestrade, ever practical, had granted Holmes special access to the premises should further evidence present itself. The constable on duty recognized us and let us in without protest. The house had the cold, airless feel of abandonment. Holmes moved with determination, past the study and up the main staircase, not stopping until he reached the door to the master bedroom. He paused not from hesitation but from instinct, then pushed it open. It was a gentleman's quarters in every detail, well appointed but devoid of warmth. The wardrobe was half emptied by now, the drawers tagged by police and left ajar. But Holmes was not interested in clothing. He crossed instead to the bookshelf that lined the far wall. Hundreds of titles, from finance to poetry, meticulously arranged. "Find anything?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Then, pulling a slim volume from the center row, The Life of Marcus Aurelius, he turned it in his hands. Something rustled within. A folded sheet, yellowed with age, tucked behind the back cover. He opened it carefully. It was a letter, unsigned, undated, but the penmanship matched Sutcliffe's. The ink was faded but legible. "You know I cannot claim her. You know the shame it would bring. She will live as her mother did, discreetly and away from my affairs. I have made arrangements, but I will not speak her name again. Let this be enough." Holmes looked up slowly. "This wasn't about Charles," I said. "No, it was about someone before him. A daughter, perhaps. Hidden even from Lydia. Then Sutcliffe had 2 illegitimate children, possibly more. But this one," he took steps to erase entirely. "She would be older than Charles. Born, I would wager, before Sutcliffe had any interest in becoming respectable." I felt the shape of something forming, like a negative revealing itself slowly in the bath of developer. "Do you think Lydia knew?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "She claimed that Sutcliffe rejected Charles, that she acted because her son was erased. But what if it wasn't rejection that broke her? I think she found this letter. I think," Holmes said quietly, "that in the last months of Sutcliffe's life he feared being exposed, not for what he had done to Lydia, but for something older, something deeper. A child abandoned, a family lie too costly to resurrect." He folded the letter and placed it in his coat. "We must speak to Evelyn," he said. "She received us at Mrs. Littleton's drawing room, where she had remained since her uncle's death. She wore black still, but less from obligation now than from a quiet sense of continuity, as if her life had not resumed but simply paused. "Miss Sutcliffe," Holmes began, "what do you know of your uncle's past? His life before you came to live with him?" She frowned. "Very little. He never spoke of his younger years. My mother, his sister, died young. I remember being brought to London from Bath, that's all." "Why? Do you know a name, Isabel Balham?" Evelyn's eyes widened. "That name was in one of my school letters. An old woman."
"She sent Christmas cards to the house until I was 12, and then they stopped."
"I once asked who she was, and he said she was no one I needed to know." Holmes nodded. "Did your uncle ever mention having other relatives? Children?" "Never. He was guarded." "Did he ever seem afraid?" She hesitated. "Once, a year ago, a woman came to the house. I answered the door. She asked for him by name, but when I went to get him, he was gone from the study. I found him upstairs in his bedroom, pacing. He told me never to open the door to strangers again. Do you remember what she looked like?" "She was older. Black hair, strong face. Her accent was northern, maybe, but she had a letter with her. I saw it briefly. It had a name written in red ink. Anna." Holmes exhaled slowly. "Thank you." When we returned to Baker Street, he went directly to his files and opened a narrow drawer marked Unresolved Inheritances, 1880s. After several minutes, he pulled out a scrap of legal correspondence between a firm in Yorkshire and a solicitor in London. It concerned an Anna Bell, born 1866, mother deceased. Father listed as unknown, but the estate contested by a man named Belham. Holmes stared at it long and hard. "The sister of Lydia," he murmured. "The first daughter. Hidden not from shame but from strategy. Sutcliffe paid the mother off, then paid to erase the child. Lydia knew, but waited until Evelyn's inheritance confirmed that history had not merely forgotten her, but spat her out." He sank into the chair by the fire, eyes alight with the grim clarity of final understanding. "It was not revenge, Watson. It was restoration. Lydia Bellum believed she was setting the record straight. The truth she captured was not about murder. It was about legacy. She turned the crime into a photograph so she could frame it, so no one could deny it again. We sat in silence a long while after. Then Holmes said, almost to himself, "In the end, the past always develops. No matter how deep in shadow it lies, exposure finds it. Just like film, the discovery of Annabelle's name brought with it not resolution, but a subtle disturbance in the waters Holmes had just calmed. Though the primary players, Lydia, Charles, Sutcliffe himself, had all been placed into the framework of motive and action, Anna's existence hinted at a deeper undercurrent, one that neither confession nor photograph had yet touched. Holmes spent the next morning not with pipe or violin, but hunched over our growing pile of correspondence, legal scraps and family records, his long fingers tracing the margins like a man hunting for margins within margins. At length, he stood and spoke, not triumphantly, but with quiet gravity. "We must go to Yorkshire." I glanced up from my seat by the hearth. Annabelle, she was real. The estate records confirm her existence, as does the contested inheritance. But there's more, Watson. The solicitor who handled her early affairs, the one whose name appears on the correspondence Lydia preserved, died in 1889. His papers were passed to a junior partner, and it is his signature I recognize from another case entirely. My brows lifted. "You believe he knew Sutcliffe?" "I believe," Holmes said, "that the web is tighter than it seems. Sutcliffe wasn't merely avoiding scandal. He was insulating himself against a claim he knew would one day come knocking." We arrived in the village of Marshdown the following evening, a bleak hamlet ringed by moorland and grey as the sky. The wind was sharp, constant, and the local innkeeper regarded us with the thinly veiled suspicion reserved for men who ask too many questions and carry London habits in their boots. Holmes inquired after the Bell family without ceremony, and the name drew immediate response. "Anna?" the innkeeper said, lowering his voice as if the walls themselves might listen. I knew her. Strange girl, kept to herself. Died some years back, 3 or 4. Took ill, never recovered. Did she have children? Holmes asked. The innkeeper nodded slowly. A boy, Samuel, bit odd himself. Left town last year. Said he was going south, London maybe. Or further. We exchanged a look. Another branch. Another leaf fallen from the same family tree. And her mother, Holmes continued. Do you recall her name? Marjorie Bell. Worked as a dressmaker before she passed. Never married. Raised Anna alone. Folks said she had a patron once. Some gentleman from the city who paid her bills and then vanished. Holmes's jaw tightened. And Samuel, did he keep company with anyone here? Leave any trace? Not much. Lived quiet. Painted sometimes. I think he worked odd jobs. Left most of his things behind when he went. The innkeeper offered directions to the cottage Anna had kept near the edge of town. We walked there as night fell, the moors whispering with wind and damp. The house was shuttered, padlocked and hollow-looking. Holmes produced a small tool from his coat and unlatched the door as discreetly as if he'd been invited. Inside, the air was thick with disuse. The furniture was sparse, layered in dust. But on the walls, hung with care, were a dozen paintings, all of a single subject. A woman with dark hair, stern eyes, and a familiar jawline. Some showed her sitting in a chair, others weeping. One disturbingly depicted her standing before a grave. Marjorie Bell, I said, stepping forward. Holmes examined the canvases with an expression I had learned to read, not as awe, but wariness. No, he said softly. These were not painted by Anna. Look at the brushwork, looser, more practiced. These were Samuel's. He turned to a box in the corner and pulled free a sketchbook. Flipping through it, he nodded once. Watson, come here. I stepped to his side. On the open page was a charcoal drawing of Evelyn Sutcliffe. Not precisely. Her features were softened, her youth emphasized, but it was unmistakable. And next to it a name. Elaine. She was watching them, I whispered. No, Holmes murmured. She was studying them. Samuel painted what he saw, and I believe he saw more than he was meant to. He closed the book and tucked it under his arm. We need to return to London. If Samuel Bell is there, he may hold the last piece of this portrait. One painted not with blood or accusation, but memory. We returned by morning train, cold and fatigued, but carrying with us the unmistakable scent of something vital, something real. Holmes made inquiries immediately, placing word through his network of street urchins and cabmen. It was one of the irregulars, a boy named Jack with soot-black fingers and a laugh too sharp for his years, who brought the answer. Found a bloke who matches, sir. Lives round Camden Lock. Sells paintings in the market. Doesn't say much. Bit twitchy. We arrived at the Camden stalls late that afternoon. Rain trickled over the awnings, and the smell of coal smoke and frying oil clung to the air. We found Samuel Bell tucked beneath a patchwork umbrella, seated beside a crate of modest canvases. His coat was too large, his hair unkempt, and his hands, stained with pigment, trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette. He looked up at Holmes with narrowed eyes. "You're not buying," he said. "No," Holmes replied. "But I am listening." Samuel stared, then exhaled and muttered, "I figured you might come. You remember me?" "No, but I heard. About Lydia, about Charles. They said it was over. But it's not, is it?" Holmes stepped closer. "Tell me what you know." Samuel glanced around, then gestured to a seat beside him. "You want to know why she did it? Why she shot him?" "She said he shot himself." Samuel gave a dry laugh. "Maybe he did. Maybe not. Doesn't change the truth." Holmes sat, expression unreadable. "My mother never spoke his name," Samuel began, "but she kept his letters. They were cruel, legalistic, transactional, promises broken, payments halted. She died thinking she was trash in his eyes. That Anna was better off unknown. And Anna?" I asked gently. "She tried to forget, but she couldn't. When she got sick, I found her journal. And I found the portrait she'd painted once, from memory, of him, Percival Sutcliffe." Samuel pulled a small envelope from his coat. Inside was a photograph, an old one, folded, creased. It showed a young man standing with a child in his arms, the backdrop unmistakably Marshdown. Holmes examined it. His eyes narrowed. "There's writing on the back," he murmured. "To my dearest Anna when she is old enough to hate me less." I felt the cold settle deeper into my bones. "So it was true," I said. "Sutcliffe had a daughter, then erased her." Samuel nodded. "And Lydia knew. She found out after my mother died. She wrote me, asked to meet, said we shared a history. Did you meet? Once she was tired, angry, said she didn't want the money. She wanted the name. For Charles, for Anna, for me. She said the only way the world would believe the truth is if someone posed it plainly. If it could be seen." Holmes looked up slowly. "The photograph. The last one," Samuel said. "The one that mattered. Death arranged like memory. A lie so convincing it looked like justice." He stubbed out his cigarette and met Holmes's gaze. "You came here thinking the case was closed, but you're wrong. It's still developing." And for once, Holmes did not argue. The rain had started again by the time we left the Camden market. The skies heavy with a persistent drizzle that blurred gaslight into halos and made the streets shimmer like wet ink. Holmes said nothing for the better part of the journey back to Baker Street. He held Samuel's photograph, creased, faded, stained at one edge, with the same reverence one might show a sacred text. His thumb traced the scrawl on the back over and over again, as if each stroke of ink could be retranslated, reinterpreted, understood anew. "To my dearest Anna, when she is old enough to hate me less," I read aloud softly in the flickering carriage light. "That doesn't sound like a man who expected to be remembered kindly." Holmes nodded without looking up. "It is an apology disguised as foresight, Watson. He knew what he'd done, but he believed distance and time would do what character could not. Forgive him. And it didn't. No, because he left no bridge back. Only silence. And in that silence, 3 generations built versions of the truth. Anna, Lydia, Charles, and now Samuel." He fell quiet again, gazing into the window where the outline of London drifted past in smoky silhouettes. The city was still bustling at the edges, unaware of the storm that had gathered and passed among its narrow veins. I leaned back and closed my eyes, my thoughts swirling with questions that felt like they had no place in courtrooms, questions of inheritance, not of wealth, but of identity, of erasure, of name. When we reached Baker Street, the lamps were burning low, and Mrs. Hudson had already retired. Holmes sat immediately at his desk, spreading the photograph and letters before him in precise, almost reverent rows. He did not speak again until the clock on the mantel struck 3. "Watson," he said without turning, "do you recall the coroner's report?" Of course. Percival Sutcliffe shot through the chest. Powder burns indicated close range. Time of death estimated between 10 and 10:30. Holmes tapped the report with a long finger. "And do you remember the location of the wound?" "Left side of the chest." "Just below the heart." "Precisely. Now recall the angle." I blinked. It was downward. The bullet entered from above. And Sutcliffe was seated. I saw it then, too late. Holmes had already turned toward me with that particular gleam in his eye that meant his mind had clicked into place before mine even reached the edge. "He was seated," I said slowly. "But the shot came from above?" Holmes nodded. "An impossibility, unless the man firing stood behind or above him. But Lydia said he shot himself. That he raised the pistol and—" "She lied." I stood, heartbeat quickening. "You're certain?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. He turned the photograph over again, this time placing it beside Bellamy's staged image. "Look here," he said. "In the real photograph, the one taken moments after death, Sutcliffe's posture is unnatural, yes. But more importantly, the blood pool spreads forward, not down. You're saying he was already slumped when she moved him. He was slumped because he was shot from behind while seated. And the bullet passed through the left side, meaning the shooter was not directly behind him but at an angle. But who? Someone taller. Someone dominant in that moment. Someone he was not expecting to pull the trigger." I stared at Holmes. "Charles." "No," Holmes said quietly. "Not Charles, he left." Bellamy confirms the door closed behind him. "And Lydia was still in the corridor. Then who?" Holmes didn't speak, but his eyes moved slowly to the remaining object on the desk. "Samuel's sketchbook." "No," I said. "You can't believe, but—" "I don't believe anything yet," Holmes interrupted. "But I cannot ignore what is missing." I crossed the room and opened the sketchbook again. Portrait after portrait, all in that same eerie, precise hand. Evelyn, Lydia, Sutcliffe. But not one of Charles. Samuel never painted him. Holmes nodded. "Because he never saw him." "Or he did, and could not bring himself to draw the man he killed." The words chilled me. They hung in the air too heavily, too suddenly. I sank into the chair. "But why?" I asked. "Why would Samuel shoot Sutcliffe?" He barely knew him. Holmes's tone was even. "Because the photograph didn't come from nothing. Lydia did not commission it as a lie. She intended it as a record. And Samuel, seeing his family's pain replayed again and again in paint, may have come to believe that silence would never correct the record. Only a final frame, an image of justice rendered not in ink but in blood, could end the story. But then why let Lydia take the blame? "Because he knew she'd accept it," Holmes said. "She thought she was protecting Charles. Samuel thought he was protecting her. They were all protecting each other from a truth too brittle to speak aloud." I rose slowly. "Then what do we do now?" Holmes looked toward the window. The first strands of morning light were just beginning to pale the sky, brushing the edge of the curtain with reluctant clarity. "We speak to Evelyn." It was midday when we called on her again. She greeted us in the drawing room of Mrs. Littleton's home, her face drawn but composed, the grief now sitting behind her eyes like something carefully folded. "There's more, isn't there?" she said before either of us spoke. Holmes inclined his head. "We believe so." He laid the two photographs before her, side by side. One of her uncle slumped lifelessly in the study. The other, Samuel's, of Sutcliffe, cradling a child. She said nothing for a long time. "I know he wasn't kind," she whispered. "But I didn't know he was cruel." Holmes studied her. "Do you recall ever meeting a young man named Samuel Bell? Quiet, artistic, often sketching near Camden." She blinked. "I've seen him. Once or twice. But I never knew his name." "He's your cousin," Holmes said gently. "The grandson of your grandfather's forgotten daughter. And the man who we now believe ended your uncle's life." She flinched slightly but did not cry. "He killed him?" Holmes was careful. "We believe the final shot did not come from your uncle's own hand." Lydia arranged the scene. Bellamy followed instructions. Charles left. "But Samuel?" "Saw the whole story and believed it required an ending." Evelyn's lips parted as if to protest, but she said nothing. Then slowly she nodded. "He told it with silence," she said. "Like the rest of them." She looked at Holmes. "Will he be arrested?" "I don't know," Holmes said. "The case officially has already closed on Lydia's confession. To reopen it would expose every secret you've only just begun to understand. And what do you think I should do?" Holmes's gaze was level. You're the only one left in the house now. The decision is yours. She looked down at the photographs. Then, without speaking, she folded them together and placed them in her lap. I'll keep them, she said. Not for punishment, for remembrance. And in that moment, something that had begun with a camera, with a lie frozen in glass, finally shifted into stillness, not resolved, perhaps, but developed, as Holmes had said, a final image, exposed at last. It was some days later, with the events of the case behind us, and the fog once more retreating from the city's shoulders, that I found Holmes seated quietly by the fire at Baker Street, a rare expression of repose softening the angular lines of his face. The photograph Samuel had given us lay beside him on the table, alongside his pipe and an untouched cup of tea. He was not reading nor meditating in his usual intense silence. He was simply being, which in Holmes's case was always the rarest mood. I settled across from him, unable to shake the lingering gravity of the case, the broken bloodline, the staged death, the buried truths clawing their way to the surface through ash and silver nitrate. There had been no final arrest, no dramatic trial. Lydia Bellamy remained in custody, her statement on record. Charles had been quietly released, his complicity judged more a result of ignorance and filial loyalty than malice. And Samuel Bell had disappeared. Do you believe he fled? I asked quietly, glancing at the cold tea. Holmes shook his head. I believe he returned to the only thing that ever gave him peace, anonymity. You cannot arrest a ghost, Watson. Nor should you try when the harm it caused was already born of others' silence. Still, I said, he shot a man. Holmes's gaze lifted to meet mine. He shot an idea, I frowned. Explain. Holmes leaned forward, his fingers steepled. Percival Sutcliffe was not killed for his money, nor out of passion nor revenge in the conventional sense. He was killed because he had become the final custodian of a lie, one that stretched through generations, from Marjorie Bell's silenced life to Anna's erasure, to Lydia's servitude and Charles's indignity. Samuel, alone, artistic, invisible, absorbed all of that pain and in one desperate act tried to collapse the architecture of erasure with a single bullet. I nodded slowly. But you let him go, Holmes exhaled. No, I let truth go. The law already had its scapegoat. Lydia was prepared to shoulder the burden, not because she was guilty, but because she understood something neither courts nor newspapers ever will, that justice is sometimes the appearance of order, not its reality. He stood and moved to the window. Outside, the city rolled forward as ever. Carriages clattered, boys cried out headlines, chimneys sighed their soot into the heavens. Holmes watched it all with the removed focus of a man who had stared too long into the photographic negative, of a world others preferred to see in comforting light. And Evelyn? I asked after a moment. Will she be all right? She will, he said. She has the will, both literal and metaphorical. She has the truth now, even if it's incomplete, and she has, oddly enough, the last family left standing. Do you think she'll find Samuel again? Holmes turned from the window, the faintest suggestion of a smile ghosting his lips. If he allows himself to be found. We fell into silence, each absorbed in the unspoken epilogue. The photograph remained on the table, its edges curling ever so slightly in the warmth of the fire. Holmes picked it up once more and regarded it not as evidence but as memory, flawed, distorted, but human. You know, he said, in the end this case was not about who committed the crime. It was about who authored the lie. And that, Watson, is often the harder truth to uncover. I closed my notebook slowly, the last line forming in my mind even as the ash settled in the hearth. And it is the harder truth to live with, he nodded once. And then, with the final click of the photograph's case being shut, the matter was concluded, not because the story was finished, but because the story had finally stopped hiding.